Autumn 1943. A hillside south of Monte Cassino, Italy. The German medical officer's name was Ludwig Häfner. He had been, before the war, a physician in a village in Bavaria, a respected man, the kind of doctor whose patients called him by name in the street, and whose opinion on matters beyond medicine was solicited at dinner tables because his training had conferred on him, in the village's estimation, a general authority on how the world worked. He had been in combat since the opening days of the war in Poland. He had served in France, in Russia, in North Africa. He knew what battlefields looked like. He knew the sounds they made. He knew the shapes that men left in the mud when the sounds were finished. He is watching through binoculars from a farmhouse window on a hillside south of Monte Cassino on a gray autumn afternoon, and what he is watching does not make sense to him. Across a fire-swept slope, under the direct traverse of a German MG-42 machine gun, firing at a cyclic rate of 1,200 rounds per minute, an American soldier is running. He has a red cross painted on his helmet. He has no weapon. He is running toward a wounded American infantryman who is lying in the dirt 100 yards from the American line, and he is not retreating, not taking cover, not doing anything that Häfner's 5 years of accumulated military experience would predict of a man in that position. He is running toward the fire. The machine gunner traverses. The dirt kicks up within feet of the medic's boots. The man doesn't break stride. He reaches the wounded soldier. He drops to one knee. He opens his bag. He works quickly. Morphine syringe into the arm, tourniquet above the wound, sulfa powder from the small packet sewn into the lining of every American soldier's uniform, pressed into the wound channel with practiced fingers. Under 1 minute. Then he picks the man up across his shoulders and he runs back. The machine gunner has a clear shot. The range is correct. The target is a man carrying another man across open ground and moving at a predictable pace in a predictable direction. There is no tactical reason not to fire. The machine gunner does not fire. Häfner lowered his binoculars. He turned to his assistant. He said something that the assistant remembered for the rest of his life and quoted, decades later, in a brief memoir published in a small German veterans journal in the 1950s, a publication that ceased printing some years afterward and is now accessible only in a few German university archives. He said, "What kind of army sends unarmed men into fire to save one soldier?" His assistant did not have an answer. Neither did Häfner. He turned the question over for years after the war, in the way that a physician turns over a clinical finding that contradicts his training, examining it from different angles, testing it against different frameworks, unable to make it fit any category he knew. In every military system he had studied, in every doctrine he had been trained in, wounded men waited. You didn't spend 2 healthy soldiers to retrieve 1 broken one from the middle of a firefight. The math was wrong. The risk-reward calculation failed. You needed the 2 healthy men. The 1 broken man was already a loss. Häfner was using the wrong math. The Americans had done the calculation. They had just done it differently than any army before them, and the difference was not sentimental. It was not about compassion or morale or the particular idealism that Europeans sometimes attributed to American military culture with a mixture of admiration and condescension. It was about what a soldier who believed he would be recovered was actually worth in combat. What it cost to let a man die of a treatable wound in the first hour. What it cost to build a system that could save him. What that system was worth in the willingness of the next man to advance across open ground toward a fortified position. They had built the system. They had proven the system, and the man running across the hillside above Monte Cassino in the autumn of 1943 was not performing an act of personal courage, though it was that too. He was the visible output of a decade of institutional work, a chain of research and procurement and training that had been built by physicians working on small budgets in peacetime military hospitals when nobody was paying attention. This is the forensic audit of what they built, how they built it, what it required them to overcome, and what the numbers say about what it actually accomplished. It is the story of a man who built the system and was then excluded from it by the institution that needed it most. It is the story of the medic on the hillside and the machine gunner who did not fire, and the question a Bavarian physician could not answer until the end of his life. It is the story of the covenant and what it cost and what it was worth. Part 1. The baseline. Here is a fact about the First World War that most history books mention once and do not examine. Artillery didn't kill most of the men who died of wounds. Shock did. Think about what that actually means. You are at the Somme, July 1st, 1916. A German 77mm field shell detonates within 15 meters of you. A fragment of the casing, a piece of steel 3 inches long and roughly triangular, passes through your thigh at approximately 300 meters per second. It has nicked the femoral artery, torn through the quadriceps muscle, and embedded itself against the femur. The wound is serious. It is not immediately fatal. The human body, which is a machine of extraordinary resilience, can survive this injury with intervention. Without intervention, the body begins the cascade of physiological responses to blood loss that doctors would later systematize under the name hemorrhagic shock. Falling blood pressure, accelerating heart rate, progressive hypoxia of the tissues, organ failure in sequence, death. The cascade is not dramatic. It is quiet, internal, invisible to an observer until it is nearly complete. And it takes time. Enough time that a man found within an hour of wounding, with the right materials and the right knowledge, can be pulled back from it. In the First World War, the waiting time was measured in hours. The stretcher-bearer system, 4 men carrying a canvas litter through churned mud and intermittent shell fire, could not keep pace with the volume of casualties generated by the industrial-scale killing of 1916 offensives. On the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British Army suffered 57,470 casualties, of which 19,240 were killed outright and the rest wounded. The medical system had been designed for a battle that generated 2,000 casualties per day. The math broke. Men lay in no man's land for hours, for a day, sometimes longer. The ones who lived through the wait were carried to dressing stations, where exhausted surgeons did what they could with chloroform, basic antiseptics, and field dressings. The infection rates were catastrophic. Gas gangrene, Clostridium perfringens, an anaerobic bacterium that thrived in the necrotic tissue of wound channels that had been open to the soil bacteria of Flanders for hours or days, took men who had survived the initial trauma and turned survivable injuries into amputations, and amputations into deaths, that the casualty statistics recorded as deaths from wounds rather than deaths from inadequate care. The numbers that matter are these. In the First World War, the American Army's rate of death from wounds, the percentage of men who reached a medical facility and still died, ran at approximately 8%, 1 in 12. And those were the men who made it to a facility. Thousands more died in the field, in the wait, in the time before anyone reached them. Most armies looked at these numbers and accepted them. Men died. This was the irreducible cost of industrial warfare. The system was imperfect. It could not be otherwise. The front was too wide, the artillery too lethal, the logistics too complex. This was war. A small group of American military physicians refused to accept this conclusion. They were not famous. They had no large budgets. They worked in the margins of the interwar Army's medical department, a department that was itself small and underfunded in an army that Congress had reduced, by 1935, to 130,000 men and was actively working to reduce further. They read the after-action reports and the autopsy records and the mortality statistics from every theater of the First World War, and they kept arriving at the same conclusion. Most of these men didn't have to die. They died because the medicine came too late, because when it arrived, it didn't have what it needed. They identified 3 specific problems. These 3 problems became the blueprint for everything that followed. Problem 1, the interval, the time between wounding and meaningful medical treatment. In the First World War, this interval was routinely 4 to 6 hours or longer. By that point, the physiological cascade had often progressed past the window where intervention was effective. Cut the interval to under an hour, and the survival equation changed fundamentally. The wounded man who reached care in 45 minutes had a different body than the wounded man who reached care in 4 hours. The first man's body still had resources. The second man's body had been spending those resources for hours. Problem 2. The tools. The medic who reached a wounded man first had almost nothing useful: bandages, basic antiseptics, morphine, which was controlled and scarce. There was no mechanism for replacing lost blood volume in the field, and blood volume was what the body was losing, and blood volume was what the body needed to maintain the pressure that kept the heart functioning and the organs viable. The body's most critical need in the aftermath of traumatic wounding is volume. The system had nothing to offer it. Problem 3. Infection. The wound that didn't kill a man in the first hour could kill him in the 3rd day. Gas gangrene, tetanus, wound sepsis. The same pathogens that had killed men in the Somme mud were waiting in the soil of any battlefield in the world. There was no mechanism for preventing their entry into wound channels at the moment of wounding, before the bacteria had established themselves. These 3 problems, the physicians argued, were not unsolvable. They were engineering problems. They required the right materials, the right training, the right organizational structure. They required someone to decide that the investment was worth making. It would take a decade, a world war, and one of the most consequential and most ignored acts of scientific theft in American history to produce the answers. Part 2. The Man They Discarded. In the summer of 1940, as the Luftwaffe's bombs fell on London and the British Army was counting its casualties from Dunkirk, a 36-year-old African-American surgeon named Charles Richard Drew was working at Columbia University's Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, completing his doctoral research on a problem that had defeated military medicine for a generation. How do you keep blood from spoiling? Drew had grown up in Washington, D.C., in a city that was legally segregated in almost every public dimension: schools, transportation, restaurants, hospitals. He had attended Dunbar High School, Amherst College on an athletics scholarship, and McGill University's Faculty of Medicine in Montreal, because Harvard had accepted him, and the segregated culture of American academic medicine had made the practical obstacles to attending too significant. He graduated second in his class at McGill in 1933. He joined the Howard University Medical Faculty in 1935. He was, by any objective assessment, one of the most capable surgical researchers in the United States. His doctoral thesis was titled "Banked Blood." Its central argument was that blood plasma, the liquid component of whole blood, stripped of the red and white cells, could be separated from whole blood by centrifuge, stored at refrigerator temperatures for substantially longer than whole blood, and transfused into a trauma patient to restore the blood volume that hemorrhagic shock was depleting. Plasma lacked the oxygen-carrying red blood cells that made whole blood ideal for transfusion, but in the critical first hour of traumatic wounding, what the body most urgently needed was not oxygen transport. It was volume, fluid to maintain pressure, to keep the heart functioning, to prevent the cascade of organ failure. Plasma could do that. And plasma, Drew showed, could be stored for 7 days at refrigerator temperatures. Whole blood spoiled in 2. He also showed that plasma could be dried. The drying process, lyophilization, which removed moisture from the plasma under vacuum and low temperature, producing a stable powder that could be stored at room temperature indefinitely, was the discovery that made everything else possible. A vial of dried plasma could be packed into a kit the size of a large book, stored in a field aid station without refrigeration, and reconstituted in 2 minutes by adding distilled water. A medic could carry 2 or 3 kits in a field bag. The entire logistics problem of getting blood volume replacement to the forward edge of a battlefield, a problem that had appeared insoluble as long as blood required refrigeration and rapid transport, collapsed into a packaging question. Drew was completing this research in the summer of 1940 when an association of New York hospitals asked him to direct an emergency program called Blood for Britain. The British Army and civilian population, under sustained aerial bombardment and recovering from the catastrophic blood loss of Dunkirk, needed plasma. Drew organized the collection from 15,000 donors across New York, applied his processing and packaging methods, and shipped more than 14,000 pints of plasma to Britain between August 1940 and January 1941. It worked. The British used it. Men who would have died of hemorrhagic shock in Dunkirk's aftermath, in the bombed hospitals of London, in the field dressing stations of the Desert Campaign, lived. The evidence was unambiguous. In February 1941, the American Red Cross established the National Blood Donor Service, the first national blood bank program in the United States, in preparation for American entry into the war that most thoughtful observers understood was coming. The obvious choice to lead it was the man who had built the system. Drew was appointed medical director. In April 1941, the Red Cross accepted a policy directive from the War Department. The policy stated, in the specific bureaucratic language of an institution explaining to itself why it was doing something it knew was wrong, for reasons which are not biologically convincing, but which are commonly recognized as psychologically important in America, it is not deemed advisable to collect and mix Caucasian and Negro blood indiscriminately for later administration to members of the military forces. The man who had built the blood banking system was black. The policy he was being asked to administer excluded the blood of people who looked like him from the banks he had created. The scientific premise of the policy, that blood from black donors was in some medically meaningful way different from blood from white donors, was false. Drew knew it was false. He said so. He called the policy unscientific and insulting to African Americans. He resigned from the National Blood Donor Service in October 1941 and returned to Howard University, where he remained as head of the Department of Surgery and chief of surgery at Freedman's Hospital. He received no further role in the program he had built. The Red Cross maintained its segregated blood policy throughout the war. It would not reverse the policy until 1948, 3 years after the war ended, when it acknowledged, in language that carefully avoided any admission of prior error, that there was no medical or scientific reason for the segregation. Drew died in 1950 in a car accident in North Carolina, driving to a conference with 3 other black physicians. He was 45 years old. The dried plasma he had developed was administered to American soldiers from December 7, 1941 through August 15, 1945, in every theater of the war, on every beach and in every field, and in every aid station from Guadalcanal to Bastogne. The Army Surgeon General would later call it the foremost lifesaver of the war. The man who made it possible was not present for that assessment. Part 3. The second answer. Gerhard Domach was a German physician who received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1939, though the Nazi government forbade him from accepting it, so he received the medal in Stockholm 6 years later when the government that had forbidden him was no longer in a position to forbid anything. Domach's prize was for the discovery of sulfonamide antibacterial drugs. In 1932, working at the Bayer Pharmaceutical Company in Wuppertal, he had identified a red dye called Prontosil that had a dramatic effect on streptococcal infections in mice. The active component, it was later shown, was a sulfonamide compound that interfered with bacterial folic acid synthesis, blocking a metabolic pathway that bacteria required, but human cells did not.
Bacteria that encountered sulfonamide in adequate concentration stopped reproducing. They could not adapt quickly enough to overcome it before the immune system finished them. The American military chemist Perrin Long at Johns Hopkins followed Dimmock's work and developed the specific compounds suited to battlefield application. The result was sulfanilamide, a white crystalline powder that could be stored dry, required no refrigeration, weighed almost nothing, and when packed directly into a wound channel in the first minutes after injury, achieved tissue concentrations sufficient to prevent the establishment of the bacterial colonies that led to gas gangrene and wound sepsis. From 1943 onward, every American soldier carried a small packet of sulfanilamide powder sewn into the lining of his uniform at the right breast. Accessible with the left hand, reachable even if the right arm was wounded, designed for self-application as the first act of self-care before a medic could arrive. The medic's bag contained additional sulfa in both powder and tablet form. The battalion aid station had supplies for more thorough wound packing. Every link in the chain, from first contact to surgical table, was equipped to apply the compound that prevented the infection that had killed men in the mud of Flanders a generation earlier. The gas gangrene rate in the American Army during the Second World War was a fraction of what it had been in the First. This is the statistic that is hardest to render human because it is the statistic of the men who did not die in the way that men had previously died. Deaths that did not happen, absences that are not recorded anywhere because the system prevented the recording of them. Sulfa solved problem 3. Plasma solved problem 2. The interval, problem 1, required something different. It required a decision about what kind of people would run toward fire for one man. Part 4. The structure. The American combat medical system that operated in the Second World War was not a single innovation. It was a chain of 5 links, each designed to solve a specific part of the interval problem, each transferring the wounded man forward and upward in the level of care available to him with the minimum possible delay at each transfer point. The first link was the medic, one per platoon, approximately 40 men. Not a soldier with medical training, a medical professional with combat training, embedded in the unit, present at the moment of wounding. His tools: morphine, sulfa powder, plasma kit, field dressings, tourniquet materials. His mission: stop the bleeding, replace the volume, prevent the infection, stabilize the man for the next link. His position in the unit: unarmed, identifiable by the red cross on his helmet, present in the front of the assault, not behind it. The decision to embed unarmed medics at the platoon level, 1 per 40 men, forward with the riflemen, not behind them, was an organizational decision with specific mathematical consequences. It meant that the interval between wounding and first treatment was measured in minutes rather than hours. The medic was 20 meters away, not 2 kilometers. The cascade of hemorrhagic shock that took 4 hours to reach the point of irreversibility in the First World War was interrupted in the second minute in this one. The second link was the battalion aid station, typically 1 kilometer behind the front. The medic stabilized. The litter bearers carried. The battalion surgeon at the aid station assessed, treated, and made the triage decision about who needed immediate evacuation and who could wait. The interval from front to battalion aid station was measured in tens of minutes. The third link was the collecting company and the clearing station. Mobile medical units equipped for more extensive treatment, typically 4 to 6 kilometers back. The Jeep ambulance, introduced at scale in North Africa after Kasserine Pass, could cover this distance in 20 minutes on adequate roads. In poor terrain, the time stretched. The system designed itself to minimize the stretching. The fourth link was the evacuation hospital, a functioning surgical facility staffed by specialists capable of major abdominal surgery,
thoracic surgery, neurosurgery, typically 30 to 60 kilometers from the front. The air evacuation program, which used C-47 transport aircraft, returning empty from supply runs to the front, moved patients from this level directly to general hospitals in England or the United States. Between D-Day and the end of the war in Europe, the air evacuation system moved 1,172,000 patients. 46 died in flight. Consider that number.
46 deaths in flight out of 1,172,000 patients transported. The aircraft involved were not hospital aircraft. They were cargo planes with litter brackets installed and medical attendants aboard. The program worked because someone had noticed that the aircraft flying ammunition and supplies forward were flying back empty, and the empty seats could carry men, and the men needed to go in the direction the aircraft was already going. It did not require new resources. It required a decision to use the resources that existed. The fifth link was the general hospital, base-level care in a fixed facility where men with survivable wounds recovered and where the Army made the assessment of who would return to duty and who would be discharged. In the Second World War, approximately 50% of all wounded American soldiers returned to duty before the end of the war. 5 links, each one designed around a specific time constraint, each one reducing the interval between wounding and the specific type of care the wound required. The whole system built on one foundational premise that previous military medicine had not operationalized. The first hour was everything. Save a man in the first hour and you had a man. Lose the first hour and you were fighting the cascade, and the cascade usually won. The German medical system was not primitive. German battalion surgeons were well trained. German field hospitals were competent. German triage procedures reflected serious institutional thought about the management of mass casualties. The asymmetry was not one of medical knowledge. It was one of organizational structure, specifically of how far forward the first meaningful medical intervention was positioned, and how fast the chain moved the wounded man from that intervention to the next level of care. German wounded waited longer at each link. American wounded waited less. The difference, accumulated across 6.5 million American casualties over 4 years of war, produced a difference in the survival statistics that the German medical officers who examined them after the war described with the same careful, deflated precision that professional men use when they are acknowledging something they would have preferred not to find. Part 5. The Mathematics and the Man. There is a moment in autumn 1943 and another in the spring of 1945, and between them is the full measurement of what the system had built. In the autumn of 1943, at Monte Cassino, Ludwig Häfner watched a medic run across a fire-swept hillside and asked a question he could not answer. He was asking it wrong. He was asking it as a tactical question. Is this action militarily rational? And by the tactical mathematics he knew, the answer was no. You don't spend 2 healthy men to retrieve 1 broken one. The American calculation was not tactical. It was strategic and it was psychological, and it operated at a level of analysis that Häfner's training had not prepared him for. Because the German military system, for all its professional excellence, had not asked itself the question that American military medicine had asked and answered in peacetime military hospitals in the 1930s. The question was, what is the wounded man on the ground actually worth? Not what he was worth dead. Not what he was worth as a statistic in the casualty report. What he was worth alive, recovered, returned to his unit. And what he was worth as a signal to every man in the unit who watched him get recovered. The American answer, built into the organizational structure of the medical system, was, he is worth the cost of the system that saves him. Not because saving him is kind, though it is kind. Because saving him, visibly, reliably, under fire, is what makes the next man willing to advance. A soldier who knows he will be recovered fights differently than a soldier who knows he will not. Not consciously, not with deliberation, in the way that a tightrope walker's relationship to the wire changes when he knows there is a net. The risk is the same. The fall is the same.
But the calculation of what to do when the wire begins to sway, that calculation is different when the net exists and has been seen to function. The American Army in the Second World War fielded men who had watched the system work, who had seen the medic come for the sergeant last week, who had seen the Jeep ambulance arrive within the time frame that the system had been designed to achieve. They did not know the organizational structure that produced this outcome. They knew the outcome. They knew it from direct observation, from the evidence of their own experience, and the knowledge changed their behavior in the specific way that demonstrated the military value of the covenant. This is what Ludwig Häfner saw above Monte Cassino in the autumn of 1943 and could not explain. Not a medic. The covenant. The visible promise that someone would come, kept reliably and repeatedly under fire over months and years of combat, until the promise was understood not as an aspiration, but as a fact about what kind of army this was and what it believed its soldiers were worth. The Germans had no equivalent, not because they lacked courage or competence or care for their soldiers, because the organizational decision had not been made. The unarmed man embedded in the forward platoon, the man who was there when the wound happened, in the first minute, before the cascade had time to start, was not part of German doctrine. The man who was never made to wait was an American invention, built from a decade of interwar research, from Charles Drew's dried plasma, from Perrin Long's sulfonamide, from the 5-link chain that moved a man from a shell hole to a surgical table in under an hour. The verdict in the numbers? In the First World War, the American Army's death from wounds rate at medical facilities was approximately 8%. In the Second World War, it was approximately 4.5%. Cut by nearly half in a war fought with weapons substantially more lethal than the weapons of 1916. The survival rate of American soldiers wounded in combat in the Second World War was 69.3%. In Korea, it was 75.4%, because the helicopter had made the first link faster. In Vietnam, 76.4%, because the chain had been refined further. These numbers are a direct line from the questions asked in peacetime military hospitals in the 1930s, and the answers built into the organizational structure of the medical system that went to war in 1942. 1% of that improvement, translated across the millions of American wounded in the Second World War, is tens of thousands of men who lived instead of dying. The 4.5% instead of 8%, that margin, that 3.5% difference, represents somewhere between 50,000 and 70,000 American lives, depending on the baseline calculation. Men who came home, men who were not on the memorials, men who were not in the statistics of the dead because the system put them in the statistics of the recovered. Part 6. The Cliff Top. May 2nd, 1945. Maeda Escarpment, Okinawa. This is the last evidence. Desmond Thomas Doss was 26 years old. He had grown up in Lynchburg, Virginia, the son of a Seventh-day Adventist who had taught him, with the specific certainty of religious conviction, that bearing arms was not compatible with the commandment against killing. He had enlisted in the Army Medical Corps in 1942 as a non-combatant, a soldier who would serve but would not carry a weapon. This created, at every stage of his training, a specific institutional problem. At Fort Jackson, South Carolina, his drill sergeant attempted to have him discharged on grounds of mental instability. The discharge was denied. His fellow trainees hazed him, stole his rifle cleaning equipment, and made his Saturdays, the Seventh-day Adventist Sabbath, a sustained project of interference. He refused to retaliate. He refused to abandon his faith. He refused to carry a weapon. He spent his spare time reading, praying, and learning combat medicine with the thoroughness of a man who understood that his weapon was going to be his bag. He was assigned to the 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division in the Pacific. By the time the 77th landed at Okinawa in April 1945, the men who had spent 2 years hazing him had watched him walk into fire with his bag enough times that the hazing had stopped and something else had replaced it. They had a word for what he was. They called him the company's good luck charm.
What they meant was, he comes when you call. The Maeda Escarpment is a geological formation, a ridge of volcanic rock running across the center of Okinawa's southern plateau, rising approximately 400 feet from the valley floor. The Japanese army had spent months fortifying it with concealed cave positions, interlocking fields of fire, and defensive tunnels that allowed their soldiers to disappear into the rock and reappear at unexpected points. American forces called it Hacksaw Ridge. The name reflected its function, a blade designed to cut.
The 307th Infantry had been attacking the escarpment for 4 days when the morning of May 2nd came up with a Japanese counterattack that drove the American companies off the top of the ridge. The battalion retreated down the cliff faces to the valley below. Standard tactical procedure. The position was untenable under the current conditions. You pull back, regroup, and attack again with better preparation. Desmond Doss did not pull back. He remained on the top of the escarpment with the wounded men who could not move on their own, men who had been hit in the counterattack and were lying in the open, on a plateau held by Japanese soldiers, under fire from positions that had just driven a battalion of infantry off the ridge. He later explained his reasoning in the simple language of a man for whom the explanation was obvious. They had no way of getting back, and he was the only medical corpsman with them, and he could not leave them up there.
He began moving through the wounded men, one at a time, crawling from position to position on the fire-swept plateau, checking pulses, applying dressings, administering plasma from the kits in his bag, working through the list of the living with the systematic efficiency of a man who had been trained to move quickly and had learned from combat how to move quickly while being shot at. Then came the problem of getting them off the cliff. A 400-foot vertical rock face, a wounded man who could not climb. The rope available was standard-issue field rope, and Doss had never been taught a knot specific to this situation. He described, in the post-war interviews that made his story known, what happened next in the language of a man who took the specific help he had asked for as a fact, rather than a metaphor. He said, "I thought of a knot that I had never seen or heard of before in my life.
As a result, with the bowline, with rope double, I end up with what I referred to as a double bowline knot. The knot worked. It distributed the wounded man's weight across 2 loops rather than 1, preventing the constriction that would have cut off circulation to the legs during the descent. Doss carried each man to the cliff edge, secured the rope around his torso, and lowered him hand over hand down the 400-foot face to the men waiting below. After each man reached the bottom, he prayed, 'Lord, please help me get one more.' Then he went back for the next one. He lowered 75 men off that cliff over the course of the day. Some of them were men who had spent 2 years making his life difficult at Fort Jackson. Some were strangers from adjacent units who had been caught in the counterattack. 3 of them were Japanese soldiers, wounded and unable to move. He was wounded himself on May 21st. A grenade detonation that embedded fragments in his legs. He treated his own wounds and waited 5 hours for a litter to become available, rather than asking men to expose themselves to carry him. When the litter finally came, he rolled off it to let a man he judged more seriously wounded take his place, and crawled 300 yards to the aid station. He received the Medal of Honor from President Truman on October 12, 1945. He was the first conscientious objector to receive it. He spent years afterward recovering from tuberculosis contracted from another wounded soldier during the Okinawa campaign. He died on March 23, 2006 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, at 87 years old, surrounded by his family. The double bowline knot has no inventor of record before Desmond Doss. He said he had never heard of it before he needed it. He said he thought of it when he asked for help. Whether you accept the specific explanation or not, the technical fact is straightforward. A man with no rope-lowering training devised, under fire, a knot system that safely lowered 75 people 400 feet. The mechanism by which he arrived at it is between him and whatever he believed about the world. The outcome is in the records of the 77th Infantry Division. The verdict. Ludwig Häfner asked the wrong question above Monte Cassino in the autumn of 1943. He asked, "What kind of army sends unarmed men into fire to save one soldier?" The answer is an army that has calculated what that soldier is worth, not in sentiment, in military mathematics, in the specific arithmetic of what a soldier who believes he will be recovered is worth in fighting capacity, in willingness to advance, in the retention of unit cohesion under conditions that destroyed other armies. The American Army had done that calculation in peacetime, in underfunded military hospitals, by physicians who read the autopsy records of the First World War and refused to accept the conclusion that most armies accepted, that the dead had simply died, that this was the irreducible cost, that the math couldn't be changed. Charles Drew changed part of the math, from a laboratory at Columbia University and a residential surgery program at Howard University, and a doctoral thesis that solved the blood storage problem that had killed men in field hospitals for a generation. He was then excluded from the system he built, by a policy that its own authors acknowledged was not biologically convincing. The policy was reversed in 1948. Drew was dead in 1950. The plasma he developed is still used in combat medicine today, in a form whose direct lineage runs through his doctoral research. Perrin Long changed another part of the math. The 5-link chain changed another part. The Jeep ambulance, the air evacuation program, the battalion aid station positioned 1 kilometer back rather than 6. Each of these changed a specific segment of the interval, and each change in the interval changed the number of men who lived. The final number? 69.3% of American soldiers wounded in combat in the Second World War survived their wounds. In the First World War, working from the baseline of 8% facility mortality and the unknown thousands who died before reaching facilities, the comparison runs against a survival rate somewhere in the 50 to 60% range for those who received any care. The improvement, perhaps 10 to 15 percentage points across millions of casualties, represents the combined output of everything described in this account. Drew's plasma, Long's sulfa, the organizational decision to put the medic at the front rather than behind it, the Jeep ambulance, the 1,172,000 patients transported by air, of whom 46 died in flight. The double bowline knot, devised on a cliff top in Okinawa by a man with no weapon and no fear except the fear of leaving someone behind. These are the men Häfner saw and couldn't categorize. The men the German system had no doctrine for. The men who ran toward fire because that was what they had promised to do, and because the system they were part of had been built, painstakingly, on small budgets, over a decade, by people working in obscurity, to make it possible to keep that promise. The promise was not, "We will try to save you." The promise was, "We will come." The difference between those two sentences is the whole war. An army that keeps the second promise fields men who fight differently than an army that keeps only the first. This is not sentiment. This is what Häfner was watching through his binoculars on that hillside in the autumn of 1943. The specific military value of a covenant, demonstrated in real time under fire at a range close enough to see the morphine syringe go into the arm. He turned the question over for years and never fully answered it. Perhaps the answer was always available to him, in the medical literature he read as a physician, in the arithmetic of what the interval meant, in the numbers that showed what happened to men who were made to wait versus men who were not. Perhaps the answer was simply that he had been trained to ask a different question, a question about cost rather than value, and the American system was built on the understanding that these were not the same question. The verdict is this: the American medical system in the Second World War was not a better version of previous military medicine. It was a different argument about what a soldier's life was worth. It argued that the life was worth the cost of the system that would save it. Not because saving lives is humane, though it is, but because the act of saving lives, performed visibly and reliably and repeatedly, was worth more in combat effectiveness than the resources it consumed. The man running across the hillside above Monte Cassino was not performing an act of sentiment. He was the output of a system built by Charles Drew, who was excluded from it. By Perrin Long and the sulfonamide chemists. by the logistics officers who noticed that the supply planes flew back empty, by Desmond Doss, who asked for a knot he had never learned and got one, and used it 75 times before he was done. They built the system. The system kept the promise. And the promise, kept 10,000 times across 5 years and 6 continents and every theater in which American soldiers bled, was one of the forces that determined who won. Ludwig Häfner's question has an answer. It took the rest of the 20th century and the full weight of the military medical record to write it clearly. The kind of army that sends unarmed men into fire to save one soldier is an army that has understood, not as a moral proposition, but as a military calculation, that the one soldier is worth it, not because he is one, because of what knowing he will be saved makes every other soldier willing to do. That is the verdict. That is the system. That is the covenant. And the keeping of it won the war.